Hi, Naomi.
Hi,
Good to see you.
you too.
It's been a little while since we talked about these important things.
hmm
And I know we were going to talk today about some pretty serious things like the end of life and what happens after a person dies. I know it's serious for somebody your age.
Sure. Yes. Yes. It's a very serious topic, and I know, unfortunately, lately it's hit close to home for a lot of people. So I think it is important that we talk about it, and I do have some questions I'd love to get into with you. First off, when somebody is about to pass away, is there, according to Judaism, maybe some premonition, something in their soul, something at all that, either lets them know or makes them feel like, oh, they know they're going to die, or gives them some sort of feeling before it happens?
Yeah, so there's an important text that discusses many things about the time of death and after death called the Zohar. And in that text, it talks about that often before somebody dies, they'll have in their dreams a close relative of theirs come to them and say, we're waiting for you, or something to the effect that they're telling them that they're going to see them again soon. I remember my one grandmother who is still alive. She should live till 120, Babi Kalbach. But my other grandmother would tell me the year leading up to her death that her sister was coming to her in dreams quite often and was saying, like, where are you? Like, I'm expecting you. Her sister was obviously not in this world already. So when I eventually saw that in the Zohar, um, it was something that I had heard about from my grandmother and other people that experienced this. So there is this kind of premonition. Again, not everybody gets it, and I'm sure there are some people who can have the premonition their whole life because death is kind of a frightening thing. So some people always think they're dying. It's psychological. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true just because they have a dream about dying. But often it does happen that somebody in the weeks, months, or even year or two before the death will get that premonition. There's another thing that the rabbis teach us, that aging in some ways part of the dying process. I mean, obviously people die in accidents, but initially the idea of death was very sudden, but then eventually we understood that the body ages or a person gets sick, and that's a process in which a person kind of, for lack of a better word, starts phasing out of this physical plane and then getting ready for what's to come. And also psychologically helping the people around them. It's much harder when there's somebody who dies when they're very vibrant and they die suddenly. There's no it's a shock. It's a shock to the system. So there's the spirituality and the psychology in this kind of process of dying that helps both the mourners and the person put their things in order, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So it was very interesting. So in certain parts of the Zohar, it talks about, sometimes somebody will be contacted by, somebody else in their life who passed away, and that kind of gives them some sort of feeling that it's going to happen.
It gives them a feeling that it's going to happen. It also is a reminder that our days are numbered, and that we should take advantage of being alive and do things that are important to us.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's, going from before somebody passes away. But when it does happen, like that moment when somebody is, considered to be alive, and then according to Judaism, when they're no longer alive, what exactly, if you could explain, like, what is that moment like what happens to you, that you were alive, now you're no longer alive.
So in a sense, that would be the most traumatic moment, and it is a traumatic moment. It's you could imagine even birth is traumatic. A baby that's coming out of the womb, it's like it's a big ordeal, both for the baby and for the mother.
Mhm.
A soul that's embodied and attached to the body and only sees itself through this, to some degree, through the sensory perception of the body. To leave the body has got to be very painful. Again, quoting the Zohar, because it's not the only book that tells us wisdom about the process of death and dying, but it is one of the greats, says that because the pain would be so great, there's a kind of heavenly favor that's done to the person that's about to die, where instead of feeling pain at death, the moment of death is actually kind of could be serene, in the sense that they're shown the divine presence as they die. Of course, that doesn't mean if somebody is dying a painful death, they'll feel the pain till they actually die. But the moment of death itself may come as not so much a relief, but as a union between the soul and the Shekhinah and the divine presence. That's the good news.
Mhm.
Now you want the bad news?
Sure.
So the bad news is that just because that's like when you get a prize, but you're also, but there's also things that need to be worked out. So afterwards, the soul will start feeling the pain of being separated from the body. Not initially, but afterwards there will be a lot of discomfort from that shock to the system, so to speak,
Mhm.
of no longer being in the body. The attachments to the body and everything that it meant will like kind of sink in, even though initially it was, I think the way the Zohar says, it's almost a trick to get the soul to agree to leave the body. Like that,
Right.
like it wants to meet the Shekhinah,
It's like when people say in movies, or I saw the little light that people always talk about, like that's that heavenly light that's like, oh, it's heaven. So then
exactly.
they just want to go into it.
You're even describing what a lot of people actually say. I'm not saying this is science. By the way, I just want to make it clear.
Mhm.
Sometimes I talk about a life after death with mourners, and somebody will say, is that science? Because if you say something and you have some authority, people will actually believe you as if it's a scientific fact. And I want to make clear, this is not science. This is Judaism. These are beliefs. And even within Judaism, there are different beliefs. I want to acknowledge that it's a reflection of the beliefs that I was taught in the books that I predominantly study and the teachers I had. But yeah, there is that thing you see in the movie of the light. A lot of people who had outer body experiences, near death experiences, or came back, so to speak, from being clinically dead for some time, talk about this light.
Mhm.
So yeah.
So, and that's sort of what you were talking about, like your soul meeting divine intervention.
You're getting a divine favor, getting like a taste of the divine presence.
It's that taste.
It's a taste of the Shekhinah. It's a
right.
little taste
and
of,
that's followed by sort of, I guess, like a fish out of water, like the soul feels disconnected because it's not in the body that it was for so long.
yeah. And you see, I don't know how long that initial bliss lasts, a minute or an hour. I don't even know how to describe time at that
But
stage.
it's sort of the hook, you're saying, that gets the soul to want to leave.
Yeah. It gets them to be okay with leaving, but then they're not necessarily a happy camper once they realize that they're no longer in the body. Once
I see what you're saying. Yes.
a little bit later, like, uh-oh.
Right. Yeah.
This isn't good. And it's okay to have a look. The reason why we have pain when we stub our toe or jam our finger in something is because every part of the body wants to be well and wants to be uninjured. So how much more so the very life force in us just wants to be in us, embodied. So Judaism has a lot to say about the afterlife, but it really has much more to say about living and taking care of your body as much as you can. But okay, that will leave for another time. That's the
Right. But yes, that's very interesting. And I do want to get back to that process, later on, maybe when we talk about like the afterlife and what happens after a person passes away. But for now, I have some questions about more about the people around someone who is close to someone who passes away, and that process of mourning for them. So first, when somebody, going back to when somebody, before somebody passes away, but people around them, and they know that they probably will, say, God forbid, somebody is very sick, what should be things that, the person and, their family, or the person very close, people very close to that person in their life should be, doing to prepare according to Judaism.
So what should people be doing? A lot of people don't know what to do around the end of life, where we have a one-track mind, which is living, which we should do when we can, but at some point it's inevitable that death will come. What that point is, a good doctor may, as I've been, as a rabbi, visiting the sick in the congregation, or the family members, sitting in on meetings, and usually the family members are really fighting, advocating for the doctors to do whatever they can. And at some point, the doctor said, there is nothing more to do. It's just a question of time. The person is dying. So at that point, when you're no longer running from one specialist to another specialist, and you kind of understand that this is the inevitable, now is now happening, death is going to happen. And maybe even before then, maybe even when you're struggling to get the best medical treatment, but the awareness the person may have a very good chance of not surviving this illness, leads the family to do some soul searching, and both to come together to make amends with each other, with the person who's on the way out, and also to help that person, if they're well enough, they're usually not well enough, to get ready to meet their creator. And really, when anybody gets seriously ill, it shouldn't be deathly ill that they actually die from it. A lot of times we get ill in the course of our lifetime. That should be a time that we start saying, am I ready to die? What that really means is, did I live yet? So if you're gonna live another year or 10 years or 50 years, depending on how old you are, make your life meaningful. It's like a wake-up call. If you're only gonna live another day, do tshuva, like get ready internally to leave this world and to go into the next world. So there's a practice called vidui, which is a Jewish form of confession. I know Catholics have something called confession, and they go to their priest and they confess. Judaism has 2 times that we do vidui. One is on Yom Kippur, where a number of times in the prayer service, we confess the sins that we've done, but the other time is when a person is dying. So that's another appropriate time to do that, and also to kind of realign yourself with what's important. And obviously the family gathers and comes together around the person who's going through that.
Mm-hmm. So for the person passing away, is that, I guess, another time for them to do a sort of tshuva, that's like the one we do like for Yom Kippur?
It is. Unfortunately, for the most part, we don't want to scare a person when they're well enough into doing it, because we're afraid if we tell them to recite this prayer, they're going to psychologically think they're going to die, and they may have a chance of not dying. So it's a very touchy thing. A lot of people end up never doing the vidui. It's just read at their bedside when they're dying, when they're already unconscious. That might also be because of Western medicine could prolong the experience of dying from what used to be perhaps days or weeks into months or even years. So by the time the person is actually dying, they're already gone in terms of their mental abilities and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. But, the Zohar does talk about, if somebody knows that they are, that, the process is, tshuva, which is
Not
sort of,
just the Zohar, classical rabbinic Judaism, even people who are not into the mystical part, believe in that, the value of making amends with your creator before you pass away.
so
I- Yeah,
those come from like classical texts.
yeah, rabbinic texts like the Talmud and
The Talmud, okay.
yeah, yeah.
So, okay, so that talks about doing, tshuva, which is like the type of repentance, and then also for the family or people around them too, I guess, then do a sort of tshuva with each other and with the person, just to make sure, everybody
It's a
is
good time. It's a good time to make up while they're still
right.
there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. And so, after a person passes away, for the people losing them, their family, their loved ones, what is the mourning process? Do they mourn right away? Do they wait until the burial? What should be the process according to Jewish law?
So there's two things happening um, when somebody dies and a relative dies. There are certain relatives that you have a halachic, a Jewish legal responsibility to mourn for. There are other relatives that you mourn along with the even closer relatives. So, for example, for parents, siblings, spouse, children, those are the primary people that in the Jewish law one mourns from. For like a grandparent, you would mourn along with your parent for them, and so on. And the answer is there's two things going on at the time of death. One is the psychological anguish of the relatives. And according to, again, the Zohar, the soul, even though it initially doesn't feel pain, eventually it starts feeling very uncomfortable about not being in a body anymore. So there's the psychological pain of the soul, and there's the psychological pain of the survivors. And yet, to alleviate that pain, what's most important at that point is to arrange for a proper burial. Let's say a proper burial. There's a lot of rituals in different cultures around burial, and Judaism has its own very important set of end-of-life rituals around the burial. So the best way of being buried in Jewish law is to be buried in the ground, in a cemetery, preferably a Jewish cemetery. Mausoleum is, for example, not as quite as good as being in the ground, but okay, it's not the end of the world because it's kind of like attached to the ground. What we do want to avoid is a cremation, which is problematic for a number of reasons in Jewish law. One, it's just not considered honorable for the body to be incinerated, because we'll talk about it later when we get to what happens, after death and things like that. There's a belief that the body, even though it's a corpse, still retains some residue of the sanctity. So we want to treat it with honor and respect. And the way to treat it with honor, respect is to clean it. There's actually something called the tahara before the burial, where it's not like a mikveh where they immerse the person in a body of water, but they pour water on them in a very dignified way. And then they clothe them in a certain type of shroud. In Hebrew, it's called the tachrichin. These shrouds, these white, simple clothes. And then they prepare a very simple, usually a pine box. There's a reason for that, because we don't want people to have to spend tens of thousands of dollars on mahogany, fancy wood. And then we do the burial as soon as possible. Again, according to the Zohar, the reason why you do the burial as quickly as possible is because if that soul is to be reincarnated quickly, we want them to be, the burial allows for their soul to be freed to come back into the soul pool of who can be reincarnated. Again, it's a mystical thing. So that's why you want to do a burial, honors the body of the dead. It honors our tradition of the revival of the dead coming from the luz, from some part of the backbone. But we'll get into more details there. And so there's very little mourning done other than getting ready for the funeral. But but in a way, it's a more stringent, more difficult time. And the word for a mourner is an avel. That means a mourner. And the time period is called avelut. The word for somebody before that period, before the burial, is an onain. An onain is, in a way, has stricter laws in some respect. For example, the onain cannot drink wine, cannot eat meat. But on the other hand, he or she can wear leather shoes. Once the burial takes place, that's reversed. They're allowed to eat meat or drink wine, but they're not allowed to wear leather shoes. Also, you can't sit on a regular chair during the shiva, the avel. But and we don't really comfort the mourners, really, for the most part, before the burial. And that's based on the Talmud that says, don't comfort the dead when their corpse is right in front of them. It's too raw. It's not because they're not in mourning. It's they're not even able to mourn. They're in shock. They're in grief. They're in extreme grief, and they need to settle their grief by doing something to be able to mourn, and that would be the burial. So that's why the emphasis is to do the burial. The only real reason to delay the burial is if by delaying it for a day or two, the family and friends can come to honor the dead. But short of that, we don't delay it. At one time, got asked, a grandchild needed to do something important, like have a special tutor that they were gonna meet, and it's hard for that tutor to reschedule. Could they delay the burial for a couple of days for that? And I said, no, that's not the grandchild should know that to honor the grandparent, they should drop that tutor and find another way to make up for it on another day or with another tutor if they need be. But that's the way. You can't disrespect the dead by delaying the funeral for a few days for some reason that isn't that important.
Right. So that clears up a lot about the burial process and how it should be done right away before the family can grieve. Can you tell us a little bit more about that grieving period after the burial? Sitting shiva. Explain exactly what that is and how the mourning process specifically after the burial, what that should be or look like according to Judaism.
So what the mourners will do generally right by the funeral is they'll rip their shirts or their sweater, and they'll do certain things during the course of the 7 days. By the way, it's not really a full 7 days because the day of the burial, which usually happens in the afternoon, counts as the first day, and the last day ends in the morning. And then there's Shabbos, which you don't really do many of the laws. So it ends up being more like 5 days. It's throughout the duration of what's called 7 days, but in reality, it's 4 or 5 days where there's actual Shiva visits happening. And that's something to keep in mind when you want to pay a Shiva visit. Everybody thinks it's a whole week, but it isn't really a whole week. It's usually more like 5 days without Shabbos, 5-6 days without Shabbos. So keep that in mind, that the Shiva goes by much quicker than the supposed week that it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. But during that period, those immediate family members that we talked about, they're supposed to sit on low chairs. They're supposed to not have frivolous conversations. They're supposed to focus on, as much as they can, on talking about the deceased and how he or she was meaningful in their life. You're not supposed to go out unless it's absolutely necessary. You're supposed to limit any business interests. after 3 days, if you have some emergency work call, you can take it, but it's some people even sell their businesses before the Shiva. I don't know if you have to go to that extreme, but some people cover their mirrors. There's a whole kind of reason for that. A lot of people won't even will not take a bath during the Shiva. Maybe they'll do a sponge bath or a quick shower or something, but they won't change their outer clothing, like their shirts and their pants. Of course, there's always exceptions. Shabbos is an exception. You can clean up for Shabbos and get dressed nicely for Shabbos. And if clothing becomes soiled and just disgusting to wear, you don't have to be tortured by it. You can change your clothes. So there's a lot of exceptions. Like I said, that's why a rabbi is good to have, because a lot of people don't keep the laws because they're afraid that they're going to be too difficult, or they keep all the laws and don't know that there are many permissions that are given in certain circumstances to relax some of the stringencies. All you need to do is talk to a rabbi that you trust, that you have a good relationship with, that you feel comfortable talking to, and they'll help guide you through it. So that's a little bit about the practice of sitting the Shiva. Many people will say Kaddish in the home during that period, have a minyan in the home during that period. Another thing, for example, Sephardic people do is they'll serve food and they'll say, I'm making this blessing for the sake of the memory of whoever the person is, that person, the father's name or mother's name, if they're Sephardic, and then they'll make a bracha, they'll make a blessing, and everybody will say amen. So there are all these different rituals in different communities, but the basic rituals are similar, which is that you sit, you accept visitors that come and talk to you and comfort you, and it's not a fun time. It's a kind of serious time. Of course, there's people that you're happy to see and they lift you up a little bit, and that's okay. That brings up the love between people, and that's important. So that's on the kind of legal and custom level. On a spiritual level, what's going on is that I mentioned the soul is agitated at the time of death, not at the moment of death, but a little bit afterwards, between the death and the burial. Once the burial takes place, the soul starts kind of realizing what's happening and it hasn't made peace with it yet, but it starts going back and forth between the cemetery and its old home, or the home that the Shiva is being sat in. So the reason why you sit the Shiva is you're kind of being present with it. Our belief is that there's a soulfulness of the deceased still hovering around the loved ones. So we want to sit with that agitation that soul has of not being able to be embodied with us. We want to comfort not just the mourners, but the dead soul itself.
The soul.
Soul itself, yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, so it's very interesting. So that's talking about the mourning process for the loved ones of the deceased. And I think that's very interesting. You brought up that it's kind of connected. What the living are still doing to mourn is still connected with the soul of the deceased in a way in that whole process. So I want to go back to talking about the person who specifically passes away, and then going back to what happens to their soul after they pass away. According to Judaism, we talked in the beginning about the process. First is they see not sort of light, but they come into contact with some sort of divinity that makes the soul want to leave the body, and then the soul is very uncomfortable until the burial, because they realize that they have left the body that has homed them, and that's a very uncomfortable experience. And so then what happens after that? What is the process after that? What does it look like? What is the afterlife that happens according to Judaism?
So there's in Judaism, there's a belief in an acclimation period where everyone, even a pretty holy person, has to kind of get used to the fact that they're no longer in a body. But the less attached the person was to their body in this life, the more real the heavenly realm was in the physical world for them, the easier that passage will be for them. So I'll give you an example. When you go into a room of strangers, how does that feel compared to going to a room of only your best friends? What's the difference? How do you feel?
Very different level of comfort.
Exactly. So when your life is like a lot, even when you're alive, these ideas, right behind me, these ideas in the Torah, these spiritual concepts, when they're your friends, you're familiar with them. So when you die, and that's how you live your life. So when you die, you're already familiar. You're going into a room of friends. When you're unfamiliar, when everything was just about your physical life and you didn't know that you had a soul, you just thought your soul is just like whatever. Like all it was about is the car you had and the, all your physical, how good you look and how many likes you had on Facebook.
If you were very connected to the physical.
If you're very connected to the physical, you're going to be in a room of strangers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
By the way, but if you were connected to the physical in a good way, because you wanted to be like a doctor and help people, you're not going to be in a room of strangers, because it's not so much spiritual versus physical in this lifetime, at least. It's more like whether you transcend your selfishness and do more for others, or whether it's just about yourself and your ego. So you could be a spiritual person and really a narcissist, meaning you could be like a guru or a rabbi, but you have the biggest ego and the biggest sense of entitlement and the most selfish. So it's not about what your title is or whether you consider yourself spiritual as much as what do you really do for other people. So the more you transcend your selfishness, the more soulful you become. Because part of soul is not identifying just with your physical selfish self, not just your physical self, also your ego, the sense of the self that differentiates you from others. So that the more you're identified just with your ego, which you need, ego is healthy, but it becomes unhealthy when you abuse other people because of your ego. So ego is a mechanism that helps me preserve myself, but it could also cause me to be a vicious person for my own self-gratification. So these things are ways of living. Ethics of how we live impact directly how the experience that we have during the Shiva, so to speak, or even afterwards. So the answer to your question is, the more foreign, spiritual, and transcendent soulfulness is to a person in this reality that they've lived in this world, the more shocked they're going to be to the system in this strange environment, and it's going to be painful for them to acclimate. So yeah, go ahead.
So what you're saying is, actually, the way someone lives determines, after they're no longer living, how comfortable or how easily their soul will be able to, acclimate what it is to not be alive, because what their soul is feeling is more selflessness, because after the soul no longer has the body and no longer has the individual or the ego, if you lived selflessly, then you're more familiar with what it is to not have a self. But if you were living very
the part of the soul is that it is a soul, not ego. It's a soul. It is integrated with other souls, like a good person who knows how to play nicely with other people. The soul is part of a whole, a pool. It's part of a soul is like a wave in an ocean, but it's part of the ocean, or I'm saying like a tree in the forest, but it's exactly, you hit it on the nail. You could have a continuum, meaning like just what you're living in this world and entering into the next world is not so painful because it's not so foreign to who you are.
If you're someone who lived very selflessly, then it's just
Somebody who lived selflessly, who had spiritual principles that also if you practice like meaningful prayer and meditation and we're able to like tap into that part of yourself that we could talk about we haven't even really talked about what is a soul. We talked a little bit about kind of selflessness as an aspect of soulfulness and not being overly attached to your physical being or your ego. So those are kind of, they're all related, but there's that and a little more when we talk about soul.
Right. Yeah, it's all very fascinating, and it seems like that just sort of, touches the surface, that it's so like you could get very deep into it. So that's very interesting about the process that we don't really hear about in other religions of, it's not this, you go up and there's a ladder or somebody in a line and ask you questions and you go here. It's more like the soul itself has this process of transitioning into.
Well, yeah, but you're asking a very good question. I don't want to rule out the gatekeepers in heaven,
Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
We have our own traditions, and there's a lot of Christian theology around heaven and hell, and we don't share them in their details, but there's certainly sometimes there's similar elements to them. So we do have like some references to kind of like gatekeepers, but I don't know how they're not such a big deal in Judaism. It's like it's almost like you're going to experience what you need to experience. I mean, there's some interesting metaphors I've heard over the years to help us understand what heaven and hell are. I'll give you a few. One is that they make you watch a movie of someone and you judge that person, and based on your judgment of that person, it ends up being you that you're judging. You don't realize it because you're so detached from what you did. So you sentence yourself. So that's one interesting one. I think it's sad. I don't think Judaism and Christianity are necessarily that different in that regard. Another one is that a person comes into, doesn't know if it's heaven or hell, but it's basically looks like a room in a synagogue full of books all around and tables and people sitting and studying the Talmud. So one fellow who or whatever book they're praying or studying, whatever it is they're doing, one fellow gets into this room, this yeshiva, so to speak, above, and he opens up a book, and it's not interesting to him, and he's not interested in. He was never interested in any of that stuff, and he's still not interested. And he is like bored out of his mind. And he asks one of the angels. He says, "I don't understand. If this is heaven, how come it's torture for me?" So you know what the angel said? Heaven is inside them.
Inside what?
Inside them or inside you.
Oh, okay.
Meaning you're just you create your own heaven or hell based on what who you are and your relationship with the prayer book or the
right. It's going back to how you lived.
How you lived and what you value, you then created. So that both stories are kind of to answer you, yes, it's not so much about the gatekeeper, it's about who you are, even to some degree when you can't make new mitzvah, new good deeds or new bad deeds, your ability to judge yourself is still there. For good and for bad. One last story that, there's tons of stories, but is that even though we don't believe that you'll physically have to eat in heaven, but this is still explains something. He says, heaven is, everyone has an arm that's like stretched out like that, right? And there's no elbow, you can't bend it. So when it comes time to eat, the people who, are the good people feed each other because they can't bend their elbow to feed themselves.
Right.
But the selfish people starve
Because they don't know how to be
because they
selfish.
don't know how to help one another.
Right.
So again, it's the same idea that we're talking about, just kind of like manifesting your ability to transcend your
Right.
selfishness plays itself out in how you experience,
Right.
heaven and hell.
So that's very fascinating because it's almost like saying, there is a concept in Judaism of heaven and hell, but it's very different than other religions in the sense that it's subjective. What is heaven and hell to, whichever individual it is, depending on, how they lived, it is what the afterlife will be like for them, because something can
More
be heaven for
personalized.
someone. What?
More personalized.
Yes, it's more personalized. What can be heaven for someone could be hell for someone else, depending on how they live,
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. But there are also descriptions of heavenly places, what we call Gan Eden Elyon, which is the higher level of paradise, or the Gan Eden Atach, the lower level of paradise. And for example, there's this concept called the various yeshivas, the various schools of rabbinic students that are gathered. Whether you could make it all the way into Moses's or Jacob or Sarah or Rebecca. There's the women have special places in heaven with and then I guess it mentions that men and women get together in heaven for special moments in according to the Zohar. So yeah, you have everything about the individual where they are, so to speak, and then you do have these descriptions of kind of places, so to speak. And again, all these things are metaphors. They're we're talking in parables and metaphors here.
That's very interesting. So it's the descriptions of heaven and hell are metaphorical. They're not, this like physical thing that maybe sometimes in other religions sort of use to sort of scare people to say, if you don't live this way, then physically afterwards you'll feel, this fire, all these things.
The fire, correct. The fire is more the humiliation or the shame of having not fulfilled your purpose, having let your own soul down, you're letting your creator down. So that sense of embarrassment, that's the greatest punishment.
And so that's not really something you can visualize until you're there, because it's.
Well, we have very good ways of feeling like we didn't do something that let's say you're given a job to do, and instead of doing the job, you just decide that you're going to eat popcorn instead. You know how you feel. It might feel good while you're eating the popcorn, but afterwards you feel terrible.
Right.
So it's kind of like that.
So it's more feelings, it's a personalized things to, your judgment will be what you feel, not so much something physical that you can describe as a place, or it's more, personal.
Yeah, we might describe it in physical. There are a lot of physical descriptions, but the rabbis, by and large, understand the physical descriptions to be metaphors.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. My last question, I guess, would be on, how Judaism sees the afterlife is. You brought up earlier this idea a little bit about reincarnation, about, why, burial has to be done quickly after someone passes away, in case there's someone who needs to be reincarnated. I was curious about, what is, reincarnation according to Judaism, because that's something that we hear about in sometimes other religions, not even, monotheistic ones. But I was interested is what is, does Judaism believe in that? How does that exist? How does that work?
So reincarnation, look, in the Bible doesn't really even talk about an afterlife for the most part, except later in the biblical text, a little later, not the 5 books of Moses. The rabbis say it alludes to it. But we don't find really conversation about reincarnation, even in the later biblical texts like the prophets. But we do, other than maybe a reference to the dry bones that come to life, but not as a core belief of Judaism. Later on, the Kabbalists, again, when we say later on, I'm not interested really in the history of the unfolding, because I believe the later on may be a revelation of what really was a tradition from earlier on, so to speak. So I'm not really trying to be a historian here, but that's why most people are not aware that Judaism believes in reincarnations, because it wasn't written about extensively early on. But it became more and more revealed that there is a idea of reincarnation. And the idea of reincarnation is that the soul can come back a number of lifetimes to actualize itself. And we actualize ourselves on numerous levels. So for example, one lifetime might be more focused on your body doing the right actions, and another lifetime might be focused on having a more rich spiritual life, or a deeper emotional life in terms of relationships with other people, or a higher level of intellectual enlightenment and refinement and understanding heavenly divine things. And so each lifetime might be for one or those other purposes. Occasionally you might come back because you love somebody very much and you want to be with them, and you've already finished, you've already done what you needed to do, but you're here for them. So there's different reasons why people come back into this world, either to fix something that didn't work, or to just go on to a deeper level.
Do they come back as themselves, or?
Yes and no. They don't know who they were, because you kind of, it's like a computer, it's like a phone that gets like, it's, everything's in the cloud, and then it comes and it's wiped clean, but there's some kind of, it comes back again without all of the information in here, but it's still there. It's still like, it knows without knowing. This idea in prophecy sometimes where first a prophet prophesies without knowing they're prophesizing. So it's almost like when you have like a sense of something, and it might be from your past life without having the actual memory of what happened in your past life. Look, the older I get, the more distant I become from my own history, because I forget so much. So you could just imagine, you really forget everything when you come back again, and then just maybe have little insights of something that feels familiar.
Right. So, but that just leads you to whatever path was the purpose that you were sent back for. Which can
because we're finishing up a lot of stuff. A lot of us are here. We're in the middle of something that feels like we've been in the middle of it forever, because we have been,
Wow, that's so interesting. Someone could be reincarnated from somebody else in a past life and not even know it, or just have that.
For the most part, we don't know it.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really enlightening discussion, and I've learned a lot, and it is really, I learned a lot. It was really interesting. So thank you, Tati, so much for this discussion.
Well, thank you, Naomi. This is a great conversation. I'm so honored. And
What did it